Picture a scenario that sounds like the setup for a dark dystopian novel, yet it is a current reality for millions living under strict gun control in the UK. You are asleep in your home. It's 2.00. You hear the glass shatter downstairs. Naturally, you reach for the phone, believing the social contract holds true. You gave up your right to bear arms so the police could handle the violence. You expect sirens in minutes. But here's where the narrative takes a terrifying turn. According to recent data from Northamptonshire, the average police response time for a burglary isn't 10 minutes, it is 28 hours. Just let that sink in. You are staring at a violent intruder in your hallway, and the authorities are statistically a full day and 4 hours away. The irony, however, gets even darker. Since help isn't coming, your instinct to survive kicks in. You grab a tool, maybe a kitchen knife, maybe an old cricket bat to defend your family. In that moment, you unknowingly cross a dangerous legal line. Instead of being the victim, the system suddenly views you as the aggressor. We saw this with Tony Martin, a farmer who defended his isolated home from repeat burglars, only to find himself serving prison time while the legal system debated his reasonable force rather than the criminal's intent. It creates a paralyzed, paradoxical state of existence. The government demands a monopoly on violence, yet is physically incapable of arriving in time to exercise it. It leaves us with a haunting question that goes beyond simple gun politics. If the state cannot protect you, but violently prosecutes you for protecting yourself, are you actually a free citizen? Or are you just a sitting duck waiting for permission to survive?
That framing, it really articulates the core tension we need to analyze today.
Right.
The modern state, it claims the sole legitimate right to use physical force. It's what sociologists call a Weberian monopoly on violence.
A monopoly?
But the whole premise of that monopoly is protection. When that promise fails, when the police response time is measured in days, not minutes, it creates this profound moral and, practical vacuum for the citizen.
And that is the mission for this deep dive. We've analyzed research from criminology, legal philosophy, and political history to really try and understand this global tension.
This balance of power between the state and the citizen,
yeah,
especially when it comes to self-defense.
Yeah, we're going to look at how policy failure can force citizens into this awful legal jeopardy, how the science of lethality changes the whole debate, and why the founders of Western democracies were so insistent on the right to arms.
Okay, let's unpack this. We should start with the concrete stuff. The measurable outcomes of these stringent weapon control policies. And the UK's experience in the late 1990s, that's our crucial case study.
Right.
We need to see what actually happens when the state tries to enforce its monopoly by, unilaterally disarming the compliant public.
So we begin with a policy response to that horrific 1996 Dunblane massacre. The response was, it was immediate and sweeping. The UK enacted the 1997 Firearm Act.
And this wasn't a minor adjustment.
No, not at all. This was a radical legislative move, a near total prohibition.
It was a very decisive action, and it targeted the most easily concealed and commonly used firearms in crime handguns.
Okay.
The law effectively banned handguns above .22 caliber, and even the smaller caliber weapons were severely restricted. You could only use them at secured gun clubs. They were effectively removed from private homes.
So what was the result of that?
It was massive. 160,000 legally held handguns were surrendered to the police, which, that was the policy objective. Remove the tool, remove the crime.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The expectation, based on that policy intent, was a huge, immediate, and sustained drop in violent crime involving firearms.
Of course.
But the data that emerged in the years right after, well, it told a far more complicated story. It introduces this concept of the substitution effect.
Yeah, when we examine the post-ban data, specifically the stats gathered up to the year 2000, we find a totally counterintuitive spike.
A spike, not a drop.
A huge one. A study was commissioned shortly after the ban to analyze the statistics, and they found that in the 2 years following that massive legal firearm confiscation, the criminal use of handguns actually rose by a staggering 40%.
40%. That's an increase from, about 2,600 incidents to almost 3,700?
Right.
It seems to show that taking 160,000 weapons from law-abiding citizens did not deter or even disarm the determined criminal element.
The short-term impact was undeniable. The criminal use of handguns hit its highest level in 7 years, precisely when legal access was at its lowest point ever.
So what did the researchers conclude from that?
Crucially, The researchers at King's College London Center for Defense Studies, they're the ones who did the analysis, concluded that there was, and I'm quoting here, no direct link between the unlawful use of handguns and their lawful ownership.
No direct link. That finding, that the legal stock of weapons wasn't directly fueling the spike in criminal use, that becomes the foundation for a really powerful pro-gun argument against these kinds of policies.
It absolutely does. The pro-gun argument is basically that policymakers committed a category error.
How so?
They targeted the legitimate sporting communities, collectors, farming communities, basically the law-abiding citizens who complied fully and surrendered their weapons.
The people who weren't the problem.
By definition, they were not the source of the criminal violence. Meanwhile, the true source of the problem, illegal firearms, largely smuggled in from Europe or bought on the black market, that remained untouched. And you could even argue it became more valuable and prevalent because there was no legal competition.
So the policy was a big symbolic victory, but on the ground it failed because the criminals just shifted their supply chain to illegal channels.
Or they substituted their preferred weapon.
Oh, exactly.
The director of the campaign for shooting at the time, David Braden, he was quoted saying it was crystal clear from the research that the existing gun laws do not lead to crime reduction.
It's an argument that the policy only really succeeds in disarming potential victims.
Exactly. And it raises this major concern in what we call the political economy of crime control. These stringent prohibition policies, they might inadvertently expand state regulatory power over, everyday objects or the rights of law-abiding citizens.
That actually reducing the harm.
Right, because the criminals just adjust their behavior.
But surely the gun control advocates have a counter-argument to this idea that there's some neat, clean separation between legal and illegal weapons.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the substitution effect is based on this idea that criminals are totally insulated from the ban, but is that entirely true?
That's a really important nuance. Gun control advocates, like the Gun Control Network, they challenge that idea that the problem is purely foreign smuggling. They argue that almost all illegal guns start out legal somewhere down the line.
Okay, so there's a leakage point.
A critical leakage point. While a UK ban was effective at removing most legal handguns, the underlying stock of other legal firearms still exists.
So what does that leakage look like in practice?
It looks like theft. It was highlighted that about 1,000 firearms are stolen every year from private owners in England and Wales.
1,000?
Yeah. So if a criminal can't buy a gun legally, the next best source is to steal one from someone who still has a legal firearm like shotguns or rifles used for farming, or maybe historical weapons.
So a partial ban might just shift the criminal strategy from buying a gun to, say, burglary, which just increases property crime aimed at the people who are still armed.
Precisely. And this moves us right into that core theoretical debate you have to solve to even evaluate if a prohibition policy works.
Right. If you take away the gun, does the determined criminal just substitute it with a knife or a bat or a smuggled rifle?
Does the nature of the gun itself increase the risk of death, no matter what the criminal's initial intent was?
That is the central criminological dilemma.
It is. If the substitution effect is dominant, if the total amount of violence stays the same no matter what the tool is, then the restrictions are, frankly, futile.
But if the instrumentality effect is dominant, if the weapon itself is an independent variable that increases lethality, then policy intervention is vital to save lives.
And that UK short-term data, showing a 40% increase in handgun use in crime after the ban, that gives some initial support to the substitution and smuggling argument. It suggests determined criminals just find a new supply.
But we need to look beyond just the usage rates. We have to look at the lethality of those instruments.
We can start with the kind of philosophical divide that informs this debate. The substitution perspective is often just summarized by that slogan, guns don't kill people, people kill people.
Right. It assumes that the intent of the person is the only thing that matters for the outcome.
And the counter perspective, the instrumentality effect, suggests that a weapon's design gives it an independent ability to cause death that other tools just lack. Their slogan is often, people without guns injure people, guns kill them.
Okay.
And what's fascinating here is the scientific data. It rigorously challenges that intentionality premise. Researchers have spent decades analyzing the physics and the statistics of violence, and they found that guns independently make violent situations substantially more lethal, often overriding the attacker's specific intent.
So let's break down that lethality comparison. Let's use hard numbers. How much more dangerous is a gun than, say, a knife or a blunt object in a violent fight?
The statistics are. They're stark. Studies show that victims of gun assaults are more than 7 times as likely to die compared to knife attack victims who sustain a serious injury.
7 times.
And when we isolate crimes where murder isn't necessarily the primary goal, like robbery, the difference becomes critical.
Right, robbery is a perfect control case. The main goal is theft, not murder. Violence is usually secondary, just to get compliance or to get away.
Exactly. And in robbery scenarios, the likelihood of death is 3 times higher when the perpetrator uses a gun compared to a knife. And it's a remarkable 10 times higher than when blunt instruments are used.
10 times?
Yeah. And look at the aggregate crime data. Firearms are only involved in about 17% of all robberies, yet they account for a disproportionate 65% of robbery murders.
So the choice of weapon is statistically the biggest predictor of a lethal outcome in a robbery.
It strongly suggests a powerful instrumentality effect.
And this drives home that point, that the weapon's inherent deadliness dictates the outcome more reliably than the criminal's specific intent to kill someone. Which brings us to this concept of the homicide.
The term homicide, yeah. It was coined by police investigators in places like Boston and South LA. They observed this profound overlap between fatal and non-fatal shootings.
Okay.
They concluded that mortality is heavily influenced by chance of events. The precise angle of the shot, whether a major artery was hit, how long it took for EMS to show up, the quality of the trauma center.
So the difference between a person surviving a shooting and being counted as a homicide victim often comes down to millimeters and minutes.
Precisely. Investigative reporters in South LA noted that for every single gun homicide, detectives counted 5 non-fatal injury shootings. The events themselves, the setting, the people involved, they were often identical.
So it's just luck.
The fact that non-fatal shootings were so common, yet so similar to fatal ones, led to that striking term homicide. It was an almost homicide. And it reinforces this idea that the universe of serious shootings is a pool of highly lethal events where the final fatal outcome is determined by random factors, not by how determined the shooter was.
That concept, that fate or luck is a major determinant, it really contradicts the substitution argument. That argument claims every killer is completely determined and will just find another tool. If they were truly determined, they'd always succeed.
And we see more evidence of this ambiguity of intent, when we analyze wound placement. If assailants were highly determined, they would systematically target vital organs.
Sure, the heart, the head.
Right. Yet research shows that nearly half, 44% of all gun attacks in one study resulted in wounds to non-vital parts of the victim's body.
So they weren't even aiming to kill, necessarily.
It's ambiguous. And the rate of knife deaths per 100 reported knife attacks was less than 1/5 the rate of gun deaths per 100 reported gun attacks. That gap confirms that substituting knives for guns would drastically reduce the homicide rate because the alternative weapon is simply less efficient at killing, regardless of the attacker's aim.
And it's not just a general gun versus non-gun effect, is it? The lethality increases even within the category of firearms based purely on physics, the caliber and power of the weapon used.
Absolutely. The kinetic energy of the bullet is the key factor, which is a function of its mass and its velocity. So larger caliber handguns, .4, .4, .45, they impart significantly more kinetic energy and cause exponentially more tissue damage than small caliber rounds like a .22 or a .32.
Can we see this empirically?
We do. The risk of death increases linearly with the power of the firearm. Victims shot with medium caliber handguns are more than twice as likely to die as those shot with a small caliber weapon. And that risk doubles again for victims shot with large caliber handguns.
Okay. We have this clear stepladder of lethality dictated by ballistics. But here is the ultimate test of the instrumentality argument.
Right.
Is the killer selecting a larger, more powerful caliber because they are more determined to kill? Or is the power purely random?
That was the crucial question the researchers addressed. They did this comprehensive study to see if caliber selection correlated with other strong indicators of shooter intent.
Like what?
Like the number of wounds inflicted, the location of the wounds, or whether the attack was pre-planned versus, spontaneous.
And the findings cut right to the heart of the intentionality argument.
They found no correlation whatsoever. Caliber selection choosing a more powerful gun was not correlated with any other indicators of shooter intent.
Wow.
Which strongly suggests that attackers are not systematically selecting power based on their determination to kill. If access to different calibers was just driven by availability or black market prices or random chance, this is exactly the result we would expect to see.
That is a remarkably strong empirical finding. It forces us to entirely reevaluate that assumption that intent drives the outcome. If intent is equal across the board, but the outcome death changes so dramatically based on the tool's power, then the tool itself is the independent variable driving lethality.
And it allowed the researchers to make a striking calculation. They estimated that if medium and large caliber handguns used in assaults were replaced exclusively with small caliber handguns, the U.S. could see a potential 39.5% reduction in gun homicides.
Almost 40%.
A massive potential saving of life, driven purely by controlling the lethality of the available instrument. It confirms the dominance of the instrumentality effect over the substitution effect in determining fatal outcomes.
Okay, let's look at one final fascinating nuance here. The effect of the gun as a tool of threat rather than physical injury.
Right.
The sheer lethality of the gun is so well known that it dramatically changes the psychological dynamics of a confrontation. It often secures compliance without any actual violence.
And this creates an ironic sort of split outcome. The perceived lethality of a gun reduces the incidence of physical injury during a crime.
But at the same time, it drastically increases the fatality rate when an injury does occur.
Exactly. We can see this in different types of robbery. In non-commercial robberies, the standard technique is often threat only. One study found that 78% of gun robberies and 64% of knife robberies relied solely on threat to get compliance.
Versus what for, say, unarmed robberies.
Well, conversely, 74% of unarmed robberies and 60% of robberies involving blunt instruments required a physical attack to get the valuables. The gun is such an effective compliance tool that only 11% of gun robberies resulted in a physical injury, compared to 36% of robberies with blunt instruments.
So the threat of the gun saves people from being beaten or stabbed in non-lethal confrontations, but if that situation escalates, the risk of death is catastrophic. It's a complex ethical calculus for policy.
The policy implication is clear, though. Reducing gun use is still the most effective path to reducing homicide. We see this in strategies like firearm sentence enhancements, stiffer prison penalties for using a gun during a felony.
Yeah, those work.
Research suggests they do. They successfully reduce gun robberies by about 5%, and critically, they do not lead to an increase in non-gun robberies. This directly counters that belief that criminals would just substitute their weapon choice.
And finally, studies looking at community gun ownership rates, they seem to reinforce this.
They do. They show strong positive correlations with firearm homicide rates, but not with non-firearm homicide rates or general violent crime rates.
So what's the consensus then?
The consensus among many criminologists is that guns primarily increase the intensity and the lethality of violence. They don't necessarily increase the quantity of violent interactions, which supports focusing on the tool rather than just the total number of violent interactions.
Okay, so the substitution effect suggests the UK policy failed, but the instrumentality data from criminology suggests that policy must intervene because the weapon itself is a unique driver of death.
Right.
This brings us back to that core philosophical tension we began with. If the state is supposed to exercise a monopoly on this high lethality force, how do different legal systems govern the citizen's right to use that same force in self-defense?
We hear this claim all the time, particularly in international media, that U.S. self-defense law is somehow uniquely lax or permissive, especially when you compare it to Europe.
Right.
We need to test that claim. We have to compare the legal standards of the U.S., England, and Germany. And this comparison reveals that. Well, these laws reflect profoundly different views on citizen autonomy, but the U.S. is far from the exceptional outlier it's often portrayed to be.
Okay, so let's start with the U.S. model, objective reasonableness. What exactly does that require a defender to prove?
The U.S. model imposes a two-part test that's actually quite restrictive. First, the defender has to meet a subjective requirement. They must genuinely believe they face an unlawful attack and that the force was necessary.
Okay.
But they also must meet an objective requirement. Those beliefs in the attack and the necessity have to be objectively reasonable to a hypothetical, prudent person in that same situation.
And if that belief is mistaken, what happens then?
If the belief is mistaken, let's say they thought the intruder had a gun when it was just a toy, the claim of self-defense will fail if a jury finds that the belief was unreasonable. Deadly force is highly restricted, limited to preventing serious felonies against the person.
So imminent death, serious bodily harm, rape, kidnapping.
Right. While some states include robbery or burglary, the common thread is the defense of life or grievous bodily integrity.
And the debate over the duty to retreat is so central to the U.S. discussion.
It is. About 75% of U.S. states are stand-your-ground states, which explicitly removes any categorical duty to retreat. But even in the 25% of states that do have a duty to retreat, it almost universally doesn't apply in your own home, business, or vehicle. That's the Castle Doctrine.
So the duty to retreat is rarely absolute.
Very rarely. Now let's turn to England and Wales, a jurisdiction with extremely strict weapon controls. Their legal standard is called subjective belief. And this sounds much more forgiving to the defendant.
How so?
It is, in a profound legal sense. Under English law, the defender only has to prove that they honestly believed force was necessary. The key distinction from the U.S. is that the belief does not have to be reasonable.
Wait, it doesn't have to be reasonable.
Correct. Even an entirely unreasonable mistaken belief will not automatically preclude a self-defense claim, as long as the jury finds the defender genuinely, honestly held that belief.
Let's illustrate that with an example. Say a homeowner defends himself against an intruder. The intruder is holding a plastic, non-functional replica firearm. In the low light, the homeowner genuinely thinks it's real and shoots him. How would the two systems treat that?
In the U.S., under that objective reasonableness standard, a prosecutor could argue a reasonable person would have recognized that the gun was a toy. If the jury agrees that belief was objectively unreasonable, the self-defense claim fails. That could lead to a manslaughter or murder conviction.
Okay, and in England?
In England, the prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defender did not honestly believe the force was necessary. The unreasonableness of the belief is just evidence for the jury to weigh against the honesty of that belief, but it doesn't automatically invalidate the claim.
So in that specific case of a mistaken defensive use of force, the English standard puts a lighter legal burden on the defender than the U.S. standard does.
It does.
That completely contradicts the popular narrative of American exceptionalism in self-defense law.
And furthermore, England, like the U.S., rejects a categorical duty to retreat. They also have a critical distinction for home defense. Force used by a householder defending against an intruder is only considered unreasonable if it is grossly disproportionate.
Which is a much higher bar.
A much higher threshold than the standard disproportionate force requirement. It gives the homeowner significant legal latitude.
Now, let's go even further to Germany, which takes an even broader approach, the broad defensive interests model. This is particularly surprising for a country with extremely strict weapon regulation.
It is. German law permits the use of deadly force to defend virtually all non-trivial, legally protected interests when it's necessary. And the most striking difference from the U.S. is that this can include the defense of mere property.
So you're saying using deadly force to defend a valuable piece of property like a motorcycle parked outside or a laptop being stolen could potentially be justified?
Potentially, yes. While the action must be necessary and proportionate, unlike in the U.S. where deadly force is generally reserved for defending life, German law's breadth is astonishing.
So how would that play out in a real case?
Well, if we take a high-profile U.S. case where the issue was preventing, say, assault and battery, a mid-level felony, German law's burden is far lighter. The defender wouldn't have to prove a reasonable fear of death or serious injury, just that deadly force was necessary to prevent the initial assault. That's a much easier legal justification to meet.
That dramatically shifts the criteria away from fear of death and toward the necessity of preventing the crime itself.
There are limits, of course. While there's no duty to retreat, the self-defense action must not show an extreme imbalance. But even then, if the defender exceeds the necessary limits because of confusion, fear, or terror, that excessive self-defense can still be legally excused.
Okay.
And if a firearm is used specifically to defend property, warning shots are typically required before lethal force can be used.
So when we compare the U.S. standard of objective reasonableness, the English standard of subjective belief, and the German defensive property standard, that claim that U.S. self-defense law is uniquely lax just falls apart.
It absolutely does. The key takeaway here is that when people talk about permissive gun laws, they're often confusing access to weapons, which the U.S. certainly has, with the legal grounds for using them defensively. And on that front, England and Germany, in crucial ways, place less legal restriction on the circumstances under which deadly defensive force can be used.
So the state might control the tool, but the legal right of self-preservation remains robust, even in those heavily regulated places.
It does.
If the legal right to self-defense is so universally accepted, even in states that restrict the means, we have to ask why. Why was this right considered so foundational by political thinkers? Let's transition now to the deep historical and philosophical underpinnings of this right.
We're moving back centuries now, looking at the classical liberal thought that shaped the foundations of Western democracies. And this raises an important question. What did the founders believe the fundamental purpose of an armed citizenry actually was? It was viewed as integral to the concept of freedom. far beyond just personal safety.
Classical liberal philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, and later Blackstone, they saw self-defense as a prime directive.
They viewed it as the primary law of nature. It wasn't just right one might choose to exercise, it was a positive moral duty.
A duty.
In their view, refusing to defend yourself against an attack was seen as reviling God's gift of life and liberty. That is a staggering contrast to the modern narrative that the virtuous citizen relies exclusively on the state for protection.
And this philosophical imperative led to a direct and early condemnation of arms prohibitions. Cesar Beccaria's critique on Crimes and Punishments was incredibly influential.
Beccaria's influence on the American founders, Thomas Jefferson copied his work, was immense. He argued that laws forbidding arms are laws of such a nature that they only serve to disarm the non-criminal population.
And by extension,
he believes such laws encourage homicides because an unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an armed man.
It confirms what Beccaria noted. These policies are designed for criminals, not citizens. He saw them as fearful of crimes, not preventative.
This is really the historical core of deterrence theory. The widespread popular possession of arms was seen as a powerful deterrent to both political instability and a political crime. The belief was that if the free man was armed and ready, he would be the least likely ever to have to defend himself.
Because his preparedness would be a deterrent.
Because arms, like laws, discourage and keep the invader and plunderer in awe. The visible preparedness of the citizen body acted as a deterrent to both external and internal aggression.
And John Locke took this principle of individual self-protection and directly linked it to the state's legitimate use of power.
That's the key move. Locke deduced the citizen's right to resist tyrannical officials from the individual's right of self-protection against a robber.
So it's the same principle.
He argued that when a tyrant or official tries to take away a subject's liberty, they've broken the social compact. They've entered a state of war, just like a highwayman. And therefore, they may be resisted by the same means.
So resistance to tyranny was seen as a form of resisting criminal usurpation.
Exactly. And this elevates the right to arms from just personal safety to a core political freedom. That's why Sir William Blackstone grouped it alongside things like petitioning the government and having access to courts.
He saw it as a bulwark of the Constitution.
Blackstone saw the individual right to arms for self-preservation and defense as a political right of fundamental importance. He wrote that these rights were essential because every species of compulsive tyranny and oppression must act in opposition to one or another of these rights. The ability to defend oneself was, for him, intrinsically tied to the ability to maintain one's political freedom against state overreach.
And this right was also tied up in classical Republican philosophy and this concept of civic virtue. It wasn't just about utility, it was about defining what it meant to be a free man.
Yes, the possession of arms was the hallmark of a free citizen. Political thinkers like Machiavelli and Harrington stressed that arms possession and property ownership were key to developing the independent, self-reliant, and responsible character necessary for a free state. The citizen wasn't a passive recipient of state protection.
They were an active participant in maintaining order and liberty.
And the reverse was also true. To be disarmed was to be politically and morally diminished.
How so?
To be disarmed was considered to be contemptible, meaning degraded, deserving of scorn. Tyrants disarmed citizens in order to degrade them, knowing that an habitual disuse of physical forces totally destroys the moral capacity, rendering men weak and dependent.
And George Mason said that disarming the people was the best and effectual way to enslave them.
A powerful statement.
We have to remember the historical context they were living in. In the 18th century, there were no police forces as we know them. Citizens had a legal and a moral duty to defend their community.
That defensive duty was formalized in systems like the posse comitatus and militia duties. The local militia wasn't just a military force. It was the ultimate communal defense force against foreign invasion or domestic crime. Citizens were legally required to help law enforcement apprehend criminals.
So disarming people wasn't just taking away a personal right.
No, it was a severe political penalty. Disarming dissenters, like the Stuart Kings did in 17th century England, left their opponents helpless in a violence-ridden society, unable to fulfill their civic duties or protect their own families.
And the founders saw the British military's behavior in the colonies as proof that relying on the state as a protector, rather than an exploiter, was fundamentally unwise.
The lesson was clear to them. Individual and collective self-protection was the prerequisite for liberty, not just an add-on to it. And this foundational belief stands in direct contrast to the modern state's insistence on a total monopoly on violence.
Which brings us to our final section. How citizens today evaluate that state monopoly.
Right.
If the founders insisted on an armed citizenry precisely because they didn't trust the state's monopoly, let's fast forward to today. The modern state insists on that monopoly, but often fails to deliver protection, like we saw with that 28-hour police response time. How do modern citizens actually feel about the police exercising that violent monopoly?
This is a deep dive into the psychology of police legitimacy. The state's monopoly on force is only truly legitimate if the public accepts the police's right to use it. And we have to differentiate public support for reasonable force versus support for excessive force.
Okay, so reasonable force is proportionate, minimal, and justified, like using force to subdue a suspect who's resisting arrest.
And excessive force is violence that exceeds the severity of the threat, like using unnecessary physical violence against an unarmed, nonviolent person.
Right.
We analyze data that test the relationship between public trust or legitimacy and support for police violence. Legitimacy is that subjective belief that an institution has the moral right to power and should be obeyed. The research looked at two main components.
What were they?
Normative alignment, which is believing the police share the public sense of right and wrong, and the duty to obey, which is a general commitment to comply with police directives.
And do these factors of trust predict support for the use of force?
They strongly predict support for reasonable use of force. Individuals who felt the police were a just, proper, and morally aligned institution were significantly more likely to support actions that fell within acceptable normative limits.
So legitimacy buys public support for legitimate policing.
In essence, yes. Trust is a tether that governs support for proportionate action.
But what happens when the police cross the line into abuse or excessive force?
This is where the limitations of legitimacy become visible. Those same measures of trust normative alignment and duty to obey were found to be completely unrelated to public support for excessive use of force.
So the support evaporates.
It suggests that public consent and the moral obligation to obey only extend police power within certain normative boundaries. When the force crosses into excess, the support that legitimacy provides just disappears.
That is a critical constraint. If legitimacy doesn't justify the abuse of power, then what psychological factors do? What fills that vacuum?
Excessive use of force appears to require an extra-legal, ideological justification. The research points strongly to two distinct psychological frameworks: right-wing authoritarianism, or RWA, and social dominance orientation, SDO.
How does RWA factor into this?
RWA is essentially a deep, often subconscious need for social control and order, with a high degree of deference to established authorities. People high in RWA tend to favor extreme, decisive measures if they believe those measures are necessary to quickly neutralize social threats and maintain stability.
So RWA positively predicts support for excessive force.
Exactly. High authoritarians are willing to accept high levels of violence if they perceive it as necessary to restore and maintain the social order.
And SDO, the preference for group-based social hierarchies, justifies the use of force in a different way.
Correct. SDO predicts a preference for social hierarchies and a willingness to justify tough-minded actions to maintain those hierarchies. Since police often direct force toward subordinate group members, lower social classes, or racial and ethnic minorities, individuals high in SDO are more willing to justify excessive force committed by security forces.
Because it maintains the hierarchy.
Because the abuse of power is tolerated, even supported, because it helps maintain the desired power hierarchies intact. SDO is also a significant predictor of support for excessive force.
So we started with the state demanding a monopoly on force but failing to provide protection. We found that the tools of violence, guns, are uniquely dangerous, regardless of intent. And now we see that public support for the state's use of force is fragile, conditional on it being reasonable, and that when it becomes excessive, support is driven by ideological factors like the need for control and hierarchy.
The deep dive reveals a fundamental tension across Western democracies. The state seeks to consolidate the right to violence, yet this monopoly faces challenges both practically through substitution effects and delayed response times, and philosophically, given the historical understanding of self-defense as a moral duty and a prerequisite for citizenship.
And that failure to protect creates a vacuum.
It creates a moral vacuum that political ideology, rather than trust in the legal system, fills when citizens are asked to justify violence exercised by the state.
We've tracked the failure of the UK weapon ban to eliminate criminal handgun use, and the scientific reality that the weapon's lethality, that instrumentality effect, often matters more than the attacker's intent.
Right.
And then we saw that U.S. self-defense law, despite the common narrative, is surprisingly restricted compared to England's subjective belief standard or Germany's broad defense of property. The failure of the state to protect, coupled with its prosecution of those who defend themselves, it forces the citizen into a dangerous legal and practical limbo.
Ultimately, the evidence suggests that when the state fails to adequately protect its citizens from external threats, whether criminals or perceived disorder, it may inadvertently drive the public to support harsher, more extreme measures. The reliance on ideological factors like right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation to justify state abuse suggests a desperate public attempt to compensate for the state's failure to maintain basic safety and order through legitimate, proportionate means. The consequence is a society where the price of the field monopoly on violence may very well be the public's willing acceptance of tyranny, provided it delivers order.